Good afternoon, everyone. This might actually be the most dressed up I've ever been for a presentation. But I'm Joe Fitzpatrick, Security Fitz on Twitter. My background, I've spent the past 15 years having fun with hardware. I did silicon debug, security research, pen testing of desktop and server CPUs, and most recently security training. My business, securinghardware.com, does a bunch of classes about applied physical attacks training, where you learn to take apart IoT and other hardware devices and pivot. Also, I run an event called hardwaresecurity.training, which train.training is a top-level domain now, so, you know, woohoo. But most importantly, the reason why I'm qualified to be up here on stage today is because I was the recipient of the 2017 SAS Best Costume Award, along with Kimberly Price. So, yeah. So some disclaimers, right? No hardware experience is required for this talk. Most of the spoilers have been removed. I kind of incorporated a little bit of a theme into this, but if you have not yet watched Westworld, don't worry, I will not spoil it for you. And I've only got 20 minutes, so if you want any more details about any of the devices I show you today, please don't hesitate to ask. So hard what? The biggest issue is people kind of dismiss hardware, right? Hardware attacks are too difficult. We don't need to worry about them. Who's going to go to all that effort to do a hardware attack against us, right? Physical access is too high a barrier, right? So we had an example earlier today where someone walked around in a neighborhood in Beirut to locate a Wi-Fi access point, right? Physical access. It's not something you can do from your couch in a basement somewhere in the United States. You have to actually go there and do stuff. So we have an argument. Physical access is too high a barrier. We don't need to worry about this because who's going to go to all that effort? Only nation states and their victims need to worry about malicious hardware, right? Hardware is expensive. Who's going to give this stuff out for free? I mean, if they're going to give me a free, USB drive, cool. But I have nothing of value. I'm not a nation state victim. I don't need to worry about this. So I'll introduce Bernard Lowe. In SAS X World, he plays the part of a triage analyst, right? And one thing he said is, doesn't look like anything to me, right? He didn't know what he was looking at. He wasn't sure. It didn't make any sense. If you don't know what you're looking at, you dismiss it. You don't really have a good grasp of what it is and how it could affect you and how it could threaten you. So here's the thing. They're right. Everybody who makes these statements, it's true, right? Hardware is harder than software, right? Yeah, there are a lot of people who know a lot about hardware but don't know anything about software. But if you've got a strong software background, understanding a tiny bit more about what hardware is capable goes a really long way. Hardware costs more to develop, right? It's not just a matter of forking a repository. If you make a mistake, you can't just git reset head, right? You have to actually take care of the hardware that you blew up, burned, fried, broke, lost, damaged, spilled beer on, whatever. It's riskier to deploy, right? You can send packets and go through 7 proxies, and you'll never know where those packets came from. But when you have to deliver a hardware implant, you actually have to take a piece of hardware, a physical device, and physically put it somewhere. There's a whole lot more risk involved in that. And it just doesn't scale. You can't have, when you have a lot of people doing a lot of hardware stuff, it doesn't work. You can't just make 10,000 devices and deploy 10,000 hardware devices the way you can deploy 10,000 software patches. So Dolores Abernathy, when she comes to SAS X World, she plays the role of a machine learning expert. She says this, right? Some people choose to see the ugliness in the world, the disarray, right? These are people's misconceptions about hardware. I choose to see the beauty, to believe there is an order to our days, a purpose, right? She has this vision of very simple, deterministic hardware machines that do what they're supposed to do. I know things will work out the way they're meant to. The caveat, of course, is that is not necessarily how you meant them to. So, oops. So consider, how do these attacks fit in the real world? Let's see. There we go. So let's say we have 10,000 hosts on your network or 10,000 hosts in your park. If you want to take over the park, take over your network, take over your server farm, how do you do this? Do you do 10,000 hardware implants? That's not feasible, right? Would you use 10,000 unique O-days to take over 10,000 unique servers? No, that makes no sense. It's not an efficient use of your resources. Now, what about acquiring, purchasing, developing, whatever, one or more O-days or old bugs that deliver a software payload that goes and propagates internally? This makes a lot more sense. Now we're talking, okay? Now, flip it back. What about hardware implants? If we have one or more hardware implants that deliver a software payload that then propagates internally, this is where we can leverage hardware, right? We're leveraging hardware implants as a more expensive resource to go and give us access in a way that would have been more difficult from a software-only approach. So why not? We have the man in black. And of course, when he comes to SAS X World, he plays the role of a black hat. And he says there's a deeper level to this game, right? We can't just look at hardware at the surface. We have to understand what it's doing underneath. We need to look a little bit deeper to realize what is happening and what's in scope. So why hardware, right? What are the scenarios that it makes sense to go and use a hardware approach? Who here has airtight security practices? No software way. I can't see, so I'm sure many of you have your hands up. But if there are no software ways in, if there's no social engineering ways in, there may still be the hardware way in, right? When you have an air-gapped system, right? When we have an air-gapped system, there is no network path to intrusion. You need to hop that air gap, and you just need to find a way. And usually hardware is a very easy method, well, not necessarily easy, but more straightforward method to hopping that air gap into the systems that are disconnected. If you have heavily monitored networks, it may be the same situation. If you're trying to avoid detection, right, it may not be worth your effort to go and use a series of software attacks to get into a system when you could just use a physical approach directly to the system you want. So what about supply chain? I'm thinking of supply chain as in the supply chain for where you get your parts and your hardware and your systems and your servers and your USB drives and your conference swag, right? An example of this, I got a token, a hardware token from my bank. My bank's a small local bank, and I was kind of surprised that it came in a hand-addressed envelope. So what does that tell you about the supply chain? How do I know that this came from someone who didn't just find a token, backdoor my token, and send it to me? I don't. If you have access to the supply chain, then that is a really easy way in to take a hardware approach. Repudiation, right? This has changed over time. As some of these hardware attacks become really cheap and really viable and really available, it might be really easy to deny that it was your hardware because anybody can buy this device off the shelf. And of course, exfiltration, right? We talked about heavily monitored networks. If you can have a small device, which we'll see in a moment, that can connect to a cellular network, you don't need to worry about exfiltrating gigabytes of data and not getting detected by the network monitoring system. And lastly, social engineering, right? People trust hardware and they trust it implicitly. No one's going to fake hardware. I mean, I've done it, but no one really is going to do this, right? You can social engineer someone and convince them to use your backdoored hardware a lot easier than you can go and convince them to install an app, which we've seen is actually very easy. If we've got hardware, we might as well use it. And because no one's going to go to that much effort to hack me, right? So we've got Maeve Millay, and she comes into SAS X World, and she plays the role of a social engineer. She says, there are things in me, things I was designed to do that are just out of my reach, right? If you're focused on just software, if you're just focused on the software capabilities, you're missing some of the things that could happen very easily with a very tiny amount of hardware. So hardware hackers. Who is this hacker named Hardware? We've got on the left, we've got a mod chip, right? Back in the day, if you wanted to play backup copies of your games, you'd solder some wires into your game console. You're the owner of the system and the attacker to the system, right? This is a really good example because these are commodity parts. You pay 20 bucks, 30 bucks to get this device and throw it in. But how does this apply to a different model, right? We've got a picture here of a Cisco switch. Some guy bought this Cisco switch, posted some pictures on Reddit, and said, hey, one of these switches has this weird thing on it. Right? So everybody's like, oh, equation group, backdoors, package interdiction. No, it's actually just a counterfeit switch. Someone took an 8-port switch, soldered on some extra headers, and put this defeat device to go and let it work with all 24 ports. So we made a counterfeit device. Of course, nation states, what are they doing? So way back a few years ago, there was the Ant catalog leaked, and one of the devices in that was Cottonmouth. It was this little USB cable, and inside the head of the cable had a wireless radio that could transmit data. This sounds really neat. This was really new for me because I always thought about hardware. I'm a hardware person. I think, oh, if I've got hardware access, I can do everything I want. I'll do it all in hardware. But this device didn't attack the system. This device sat and connected to a compromised system, and the compromised system used software to use the hardware in here to exfiltrate data. So we've got a level of decoupling. We're no longer attacking just with hardware. We're using hardware to add some features, to add some abilities to compromised systems. Of course, bored hackers, the NSA playset, this was a project done by Mike Osman and Dominic Spill. They went and they recreated the Cottonmouth. They called it Turnip School. And on that little circuit board, the size of a USB cable, They put a wireless USB hub and a wireless radio. OK. They reproduced hundreds of thousands of dollars of effort in a few $100s worth of effort. But now we've got this scenario. Anybody with $7 can go on AliExpress and buy one of these cables. Looks like a USB charging cable, but inside you open it up, you've got a slot for your SIM card. You've got a GSM radio. You've got a microphone. And so you put your SIM card in there, you give this to someone, and then you call the number. Anytime that cable's plugged in, it just gets power. It's not connected to the system. It gets power, you call the device, and you have an open mic, and you listen to what they're doing. You send it a text message. It sends you back coordinates of where the device is located based on cell tower location. So this is $7. This is a big deal, right? Who thinks they need to be protected against attackers that are willing to spend $7, right? So we've got these other devices that we often get. Who got one of these yesterday? It's this little black box. It's not black, it's silver, but whatever. It's this little black box that we're supposed to plug USB things into, right? And we all get taught not to plug USB things into things, but we do it anyway, right? We've got this device. The whole purpose is to protect us, but we don't know what's inside that box unless we've taken it apart and know what we're doing, right? Anything you've got an extra 5mm square of space, you can probably fit that one of those little GSM modules. You can probably fit a USB attack device. There's a lot you can do with that much space. And as we talk lower and lower level, if we got physical access to a server and you get time where you can actually open up a case, you can install a device. The top one is SolderPeek, which is a JTAG implant, open source JTAG implant. The bottom one is a board used for Slot Screamer. It's used for PCI Express DMA attacks. If you have the opportunity to plug one of these into a system closes up. Most people will never notice this happened, and you've got a way to persist on a system that will bypass a lot of wiping and other defenses. And lastly, this little device, this is a $5 iBeacon module. So it's a Bluetooth radio, and it's got a processor, and it's programmable. So I can get these for $5 and program these to just sniff Bluetooth MAC addresses, right? We've seen examples of this in the past 10 years where people get PCs, and they put Bluetooth radios, and they hide them in trash cans, and they log all the Bluetooth addresses that walk by. That's pretty cool. But when it's $5, you spend $500, you've got 100 of them, right? You've got 100 of them, you put one at every intersection in a 10 by 10 block square in a city. You have poor man's surveillance right here. So Maeve Millay, again, she's chatting with one of the other people in a SaaSX world, and she says, I see you've already met your makers, these hardware hackers, right? Armistice, a bug bounty collector, she has to say back, well, they don't look like gods, meaning there's no magic skills to this. Anybody can do this stuff, or anybody can find the person with the skills to do this. These are not magical skills. These are not gods making these hardware devices. So we're in. Now what? Pivot. Hardware is hard, so let's make it easier. What's the approach to do this? Step one, use physical access to mount a hardware attack. Okay? Step two, now that we have physical access, we've done a hardware attack, we'll use hardware to escalate software privilege. Whether this is a USB rubber ducky that goes and runs a couple shell commands that go and give you privilege, or goes and spoofs a network connection that goes and min in the middles some of your traffic. We do something to get our software privilege. Step three, now that we have software privilege, now we do all the dirty work, right? We're at the same point we were if we started with a software-only approach, but we might have been able to short-circuit some of the more difficult situations. So Peter Abernathy, he plays the role of an InfoSec burnout in a SaaSX world. There we go. These violent delights have violent ends. And he might have been misquoted, because what I heard these hardware delights have software ends, right? The reason we're pursuing hardware and all these little hardware things that we can do is not just because we like hardware. Actually, that is why I do it. But the end is that software, and software privilege and remote access is what these hardware attacks are going to buy us. So use it when it's easy, right? Got an organized campaigns. You could spend your time doing multiple hops through different systems, pivoting from software device to software node to software node, versus handing the right person a USB key that they accidentally plug into something in the server room, right? Which one is the better approach? Which one is the shorter approach? Maybe it's worth it to take both paths and see which one works out better. Red team engagement? OK. Well, you don't need to be a nation-state target in order to be a hardware attack victim. And if your employees of your company aren't aware of that, perhaps it's your job to teach them some way or another. And finally, a simple pen test, right? And this is often a scenario people ask, like, why do we, if I'm doing a pen test, I can just do all the software stuff. Why would I go out of my way to take a physical attack on a system? The purpose is you use a physical attack to inform the software attack. You use the ability to go and take chips off a system and dump firmware. You use the ability to insert PCI Express or memory devices that are backdoored to go and allow you to observe more about how the software works. Right? Your objective when you attack an IoT device from a hardware perspective is not to build a hardware attack, but to inform the software attack that will come later and will scale. So finally, we have Hector Escatone. He is an unsolicited bounty collector. And he says, no matter how dirty the business, do it well. Okay? So, good. I am right on time. I'm moving a little quickly, but that's OK. Is hardware magic? A lot of people say it looks like magic. If you don't understand how it works, it may seem like magic. But look at our original assumptions. Hardware attacks are too difficult, right? Well, hardware attacks are not difficult. We've got examples where you can buy off-the-shelf hardware to mount a hardware attack. You have the ability to customize readily available hardware to mount a hardware attack. You have the ability to custom design hardware in a way that's actually a whole lot easier than it has been any time in the past 20 years. Which make a hardware attack a lot simpler. Another thing is these skills to do hardware stuff. They may not exist readily in the InfoSec world. And one of the things I often show, I show pictures of fine soldering. And everybody's like, oh, I could never do that. You don't have to. There are lots of people who are really good at soldering that know nothing about InfoSec, but are really good at soldering. So you just find someone who's good at soldering, and your problems are solved. Physical access is too high a barrier for most attackers. Okay? Physical access is not a high barrier, right? Sometimes physical access does mean you need 2 hours sitting next to a box to do something. But remember, we don't want to mount the whole attack from physical access. We want to use physical access to get our hardware device in there, and then we back off. Physical access might mean opening up the case. It might mean plugging something in. It might be social engineering. It might be convincing someone else to plug something in. It might be proximity, that's all you need. You just need to be on their local network, their local wireless, or something like that. You also have a variety of ways to go and proxy this physical access. And finally, only nation states and their victims need to worry about malicious hardware, right? Because it's readily available, because it's inexpensive, because it's so feasible, everyone is truly vulnerable to malicious hardware. Right? Anybody who's got one of those little USB disconnector box thingies, how do you know it's safe? Anybody who has a USB charging cable, how do you know that it's just a USB charging cable and doesn't have that little SIM radio and module inside it? It's very difficult to know. I'm really fascinated in particular by that device because it changes the whole mindset of things. No longer am I worried about physically coupling, connecting, and actually talking to the computer. I just have a device that's in proximity of me that can do things. And so lastly, we've got Dr. Robert Ford. When he comes to SaaS X World, he plays the role of full stack developer. That's like full stack, down into the hardware, not like these internet full stack fake things. And he says everything in this world is magic. Obviously, he's talking about hardware, except to the magician. And so that's kind of the point that I want to express. Everything is magic. When we understand the skills the magician used to create the magic, it dispels the magic. It makes it realize it's accessible to us. And kind of to wrap this all up, I've got a short video. I got some friends to help me with put together, just to show you a little bit of a kind of a short film. Oh, OK. A short film about the hardware exploitation process. So, sound. Is there sound? And just because I knew David Jacoby was moderating this session, the music is chip tunes as opposed to the original. And that is the hardware pivot.
Oh my God, oh my God. Joe Fitzpatrick, everybody.